Do you want to write an article for publication in the Journal of Trauma Nursing, but you don't know where to start? Well, I have some information for you that might help. Hi, I'm Catherine Schrader, and I'm the editor of the Journal of Trauma Nursing. And I'd like to take a few minutes to give you a brief overview of what you might need to know or do before you get started in writing an article for publication. And first of all, the question is, what topic do you want to write about? And there's many different topics that are covered in the journal. The journal covers actually the continuum of trauma nursing care. So you could be writing about something from prevention or preparedness through first responders, through emergency department, through perioperative care, operating room surgery, critical care, rehab, and monitoring care after that. It covers the entire gamut along the trauma continuum. So if you'd like to think of an article, the best way to get started is to think of what topic is of interest to you, what is your practice area, and write about something that's familiar to you. If you haven't written before, write about something with which you are familiar. That's the best way to get started. Sometimes it helps to think about your topic in different types of categories. And I break it down into 3 or 4 different areas. One would be an article where you're sharing your personal experience or opinion about something. And we call those types of articles an editorial or a personal viewpoint. And these are articles where you are actually sharing your specific perspective on a topic, whether it is texting and driving or whether it's an editorial on a topic that is very important to you, the importance of, say, specialty practice such as pediatrics or geriatrics or a specific role within trauma. These are things that you're writing about, but you're basically writing your personal viewpoint and you're sharing your thoughts on it. It isn't something that's been scientifically measured or analyzed, such as evidence-based practice projects, quality improvement, or research, but yet it's something that you may be sharing based on your personal experience. The other area that most people, I would say, write about when they write about trauma nursing would be clinically related topics. And those are specific topics on things like as advanced practice, specialty practice, education, case studies. A lot of nurses like to write about a case study, a case that you had that was really, really different or interesting, something that everyone in the department, when you look back on the care that you provided for that patient, what did you learn from this? It's the type of an article you can write where you're telling people, here are the lessons we learned, and here's what we'll do in the future so that we can be better prepared to take care of these types of patients again. So a lot of clinical topics are just that. They are nurses writing about certain practice areas with which they are most familiar or have a certain area of specialty practice experience. The other area would be research, quality improvement, or evidence-based practice. And these types of articles or manuscripts usually require a very structured type of design of the article, especially for research. So when you look on the website for the Journal of Trauma Nursing, you'll see here's the format in which you would write a research article. The format in which you'd write a quality improvement article is a little bit different. And if you're writing an evidence-based practice project or a research review, you're going to use a different format. And the best way to find out what format to write your article in is to look at what other articles similar to your topics or similar to your design that you want to use, which look at some previously published articles so you can see how does the flow of that article go. By reading other articles that are similar to what you would like to write about, you'll be able to get a good perspective on how you could structure the setup of your manuscript and put it into some sections that'll help you focus your thoughts and focus your writing. The other area is, I call it leadership, but it's everything from, it could be management aspects, it could be administration, it could be related to trauma systems. There's a lot of things that can be put into the aspect of leadership. So that's another area that you could consider writing about You can be a leader in almost any area of nursing. In fact, I would argue that all nurses are leaders. So leadership is an important area about which to write. So let's say that you have decided on a topic, or maybe a couple different topics, and you're now deciding, well, I'd like to get an idea of how I should format my article. How should my article look as I'm thinking of writing down what information I need to follow with what flow. And when you're writing an article, just one of the things I tell authors to remember is you're writing a story about something. So it's going to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And thinking in that way starts getting your brain into the focus of how do I want to write down what I'm going to talk about, what I'm going to write about in my article. So you first have to come up with the beginning and what is it that this article is going to discuss. You're going to basically be telling the readers, here's what I'm going to talk about, and here's why it's important that I talk about it. Then you can segue into the middle part. Middle part is here's what I'm talking about. Here's where you tell the gist of what you want. Now within the middle part, there may be some sections that you'll be putting in, but that would vary depending again on your topic. So one way you can look at that is, and I mentioned it in the previous slide, is look at other articles in the journal that kind of have a similar idea such as yours. So you can see, how did they format that? How did they tell their story? What did they use for their beginning, middle, and end? You always have to make sure when you're submitting to any journal that you submit in their preferred format. Does the journal use the APA format for writing? Do they use the AMA writing format? You need to look at that before you submit so that you can be sure that you're submitting in the correct format. The Journal of Trauma Nursing uses the APA format for all of our manuscripts that are submitted. Also, the journal will have, any journal will have this, but the Journal of Trauma Nursing journal has a site on our site that locates the author guidelines for you, and it should be found right away when you get to our first page. You want to read through the author guidelines so that you can follow them. Follow the word limits. It'll say here's how many word limits. Here's the word limit for the abstract of your article. Here's how many words should be in certain things. So if there are word limits specified in any journal, be sure that you follow them. If you don't follow them, they may not want to publish your manuscript, or they'll send it back to you for revision and say you need to be within the word limits. So always make sure you review the author guidelines before you submit a manuscript to the journal. If you have questions about guidelines and you would like more clarification, you may feel free to email me as the editor and I can clarify the information for you. When you're thinking about writing a manuscript, one of the things you need to think about is, am I writing this manuscript alone, or am I going to be writing with a group, or am I going to have a co-author? How are you going to be working on deciding who's going to be writing this manuscript, or who will be working on this manuscript with you? And thinking about your manuscript often begins when you start planning a project in your department. It can also start when you're just thinking that you would like to write something alone. But if you're going to implement a project in your department, maybe a quality improvement project, or you have an interesting patient care case that came up, and afterwards you're talking with some of your coworkers about, oh, that was a difficult case, here's what we did, maybe we should try this next time. When you first start talking about topics, that's when you should start thinking, is this something I'd like to submit as a manuscript? Is this something I would like to share with other nurses and other readers so that they might benefit from my experience that I had? So when you start thinking about your manuscript, you're thinking about it right when you experience maybe a project at work, or getting prepared for a project in your healthcare environment, or maybe completed an interesting case that you were caring for. If you decide that you're going to work collaboratively, decide at the beginning of when you're talking about it, who's going to be working with you on this project? Who are the people that would be involved? And are the people that are involved in the project, do they want to be an author in this paper with you? Or do they just want to work on other aspects of it, but maybe not actually do any of the detailed writing of a paper? You need to establish who's going to write the paper, and if so, what aspects do they want to write about the paper, or if they just want to participate on it. If they don't meet the criteria for being an author, you can still acknowledge them in your paper when you submit it by writing an acknowledgement section at the end of your manuscript where you tell these people we're involved in this and we appreciate all the work they did. You maybe can mention what type of work they did, but that's where you would put people who wanted to work on your project but really didn't want to be involved in the actual writing of a manuscript. Now that you've gotten some topics in your mind ready to work on, or you have a project identified, you have looked at the Journal of Trauma Nursing website, reviewed author guidelines, and you're beginning the formation and structure of your manuscript, I'd like to share a few tips with you. And one of the tips is to not include identifying author information in the text or the body of your manuscript. It's better to talk in more generalities as opposed to using specific persons' names. If you write about an organization, if you have permission to use the name of your organization, you may use it in a manuscript, but oftentimes, as you'll probably recall in research manuscripts, you'll see them say it was a large 500-bed hospital on the East Coast of the United States, or they'll give you more of a generic location of it, and that's usually preferred in many of the formats of articles that you'll see written in medical and nursing journals. Also, use headings to organize your manuscript. It makes it much easier for the reader to follow, and it also helps you as you write to identify the flow of your article. It helps you focus on the beginning, middle, and end, and how to put the pieces in between. When you use abbreviations or acronyms, at the first time you mention it in your text, you need to put a definition of it beforehand. So you need to say something like intensive care unit, and then in parentheses after that, ICU, and then go on further throughout your article you can then just say ICU. You don't have to define it every time you use it after that. However, you want to avoid an excessive use of acronyms or abbreviations. It makes it a little choppy for the reader. It's nice to break it up, and if there's alternate terms that you can use, to work those in. Also, don't start a sentence with an acronym. It's best to write it out when you're first stating it. So in case you wanted to write something about an ICU nurse and you say, ICU nurses do this, it's better technique to say, critical care nurses do this, or intensive care unit nurses do this, as opposed to starting your sentence with ICU. And the last thing is to always be aware of the potential for plagiarism. Sometimes we're so used to certain things that we'll write it down and we know it, but you need to provide citations for things that you're giving especially specific information about. So if you say that statistically speaking that there's more accidents occur or more injuries occur in the summer than in this, if you're just saying that, you have to give a citation of where did you get that from, because if you're giving a statement like that, it always requires support. So you'll need to make sure you have citations. Otherwise, it looks like you are making up this and you did a study that supported this. And so be sure that you cite as needed. When you're using quotes in an article, of course you're going to cite them, but what I would caution you against is using an excessive amount of quotes. You want your article or your manuscript to be you writing about these things and you synthesizing the information and writing about how you do this in your practice. You don't want to just make your whole article a series of quotes of other people talking about something, because then there's no substance or content really showing what your perspective is or what you did that's different. And if you have written before and published something and you're going to cite yourself, you still have to cite yourself, even though you would think, well, I wrote this, why do I have to cite myself? Well, if you don't, it's self-plagiarism. When you publish something in another journal, they now have copyright for that article and for what you said. So even if you're citing yourself and you wrote the article or you did the research, you still need to be sure to put your own citation, because it's you, but someone else owns the copyright to your words. Here's a few more tips. Again, if you're using a brand name, for some topic, and the best recommendation is to not use brand names, but if you need to, you have to supply the manufacturer's name and the address, the city, state, and country. You need to acknowledge all forms of support. Did you get support for doing a project, for a quality improvement project, a research project? You need to tell what type of support you got, and that usually goes in an acknowledgement at the end of the manuscript. When you're writing, avoid writing like how you speak. Don't use colloquial terms, or also don't use terms that are so very antiquated, like something like henceforth, something that Robin Hood might have said talking to his merry men in ye olde England. Use terms that are current terms but are not colloquial. Use terms that everyone will understand, and then your meaning will be put forth in the way in which you'd like it to be. Also, if you're a student, you're going to school, you're writing a lot of papers, and your professor will maybe say to you, why don't you submit this paper for publication? Or if you write a master's thesis, or a doctoral or a D&P paper, a dissertation or quality improvement capstone paper, and you're going to submit it for publication. What you want to do is not submit your paper exactly as you have written it for school, because how you write it for school is not going to be the same way in which you would write it for a journal. You're not going to be able to submit as many pages as you might have had for a school project, nor do you need maybe as large of a literature review as you would for a school paper or for a paper needed for academia. So even if you're in graduate school, your paper still won't reflect the same type of structure specifically used for a journal, and it's usually going to be many less pages required to be published in a journal than it would for a dissertation or a thesis. As an editor, I need to adopt processes that encourage accuracy, completeness, and clarity of research reporting and other clinical information. So I need to make sure that what you're writing or what someone is submitting is accurate information. And one of the ways I do this is by ensuring that authors submit things following specific guidelines. And I also make sure that all of our manuscripts are peer reviewed. And they look at the articles that are submitted for content verification. Is this practice current practice? Is it practice that is outdated, or is it not approved practice? Is it considered experimental or dangerous practice? We need to know that before we can go ahead and print certain aspects of patient care information. So if you're concerned about what things must be followed, you could go to the website at www.publicationethics.org and review some of those tips that you could find there. I need to make sure that if you're doing a research, if you're submitting a research article, that you have submitted your research study for IRB approval and that you have IRB approval. And there should be a statement in any research manuscript that's submitted that states that IRB approval was obtained to do this study. In addition, for quality improvement projects, the quality improvement projects are now falling under a different type of a guideline, and it's called SQUIRE, which is Standards for Quality Improvement Reporting Excellence. And the Journal of Trauma Nursing, as well as all Lippincott, Williams, and Wilkins published journals, must adhere to the SQUIRE guidelines for all quality improvement reports that we have submitted for publication. So this requires that you take your quality improvement project and have it approved by your organizational IRB, so that we have the same requirement for quality improvement publications as we do for research publications, in that there has to be a statement in the quality improvement paper stating that IRB approval was obtained, in that it could be designated as non-human subject research, or it can be designated as quality improvement, but there has to be a statement in all quality improvement reports submitted that IRB approval or designation was obtained for this quality improvement project. When you're submitting your manuscript to our journal website, which is www.editorialmanager.com/JTN, you'll be asked some questions and things that you need to consider. So I would ask you to consider them before you submit so that you're aware of them, which again, you'll find in the author guidelines. But your manuscript is, again, ethically considered an original contribution. You're not supposed to submit something that's already been published before. You are not supposed to submit something that someone else has published and you were a member of their team and you're submitting the same thing, only now you're taking a different author role in it. If it's been published previously, we cannot accept it at the Journal of Trauma Nursing, and nor could other journals accept it. You have to submit only to one journal at a time. So one of the questions you'll be asked when you submit is this manuscript under consideration for publication elsewhere in any other journal? And if you say yes, then you cannot submit to the Journal of Trauma Nursing until you hear from the other journal whether or not they're going to accept it. And if they accept it, you have to determine whether or not you're going to publish it there or if you are going to wait and publish it elsewhere. But you can't submit to multiple journals at the same time. We won't review your article until we know that you have not submitted it elsewhere. So you need to answer honestly because it all falls under publication ethics. Now, if you have taken your information, say you did a quality improvement project or a research study, and you've presented it at a conference as a poster, you did a research poster on it, or you've written maybe an abstract and you had it published in the manuscript, in the booklet that comes out at a conference, that is not considered being published elsewhere in a similar form. It would only be if you had published your information in another manuscript form published in a journal as an article. So if you've done something where you just had an abstract published or you've had a poster that you presented, then that does not stop you from submitting your manuscript to the Journal of Trauma Nursing or other journals. So you just need to be aware of what that clarification is. Also, each person who you list as an author is expected to have participated in the study or the project to a significant extent. So we have to make sure that we're looking at the validity of published manuscripts. The final responsibility rests with the authors to determine who is considered an author and who is not, and if these authors have met the criteria that we use, as opposed to me as the editor or the publisher, because we don't know what everybody did. So the presumption is you're telling the truth, and when you're saying here's who did what in writing this journal article. The Journal of Trauma Nursing and all journals that are published by Lippincott, Williams, and Wilkins use the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors guidelines for author criteria. And based on this criteria, they would state that an author must meet all of the following 3 criteria. So if you've been working with multiple people on a project or a study, and now you're writing it up, and many people say, I want to be listed as an author on this when you submit it. Well, you have to ask the questions of every author, and you have to also indicate what each author's contribution was when you submit your manuscript to any journal. And the criteria they have to meet are as follows. You have to meet A and B and C. So under A, you have to say, did this author conceive and design the work that you're writing about? Did they analyze or interpret data involved, or did they collect data or other material? They have to have done one of those 3 things to meet that first part of the criteria for being an author. But they also have to have completed something from B, which is, did they write the manuscript or a part of the manuscript? Or did they revise the manuscript to make important changes in content? They have to have done one of those 2 things listed in letter B. And the last thing all authors have to do is approve the final version of the manuscript before you submit it for publication. So if you have any authors that have not met something from A, something from B, and C, they cannot be listed as an author. So you have to make sure you review this with all authors and all potential authors to see about submitting their names as an author for your article. If you have 20 people that worked on something and you submit 20 people's names as authors, but your paper is only 5 or 6 pages long, As an editor, I'm not going to think that they all could have written something, and if they did not submit substantial parts of writing that manuscript because it's a short manuscript. So you can't have many people. Usually, a minimum amount of people would possibly be 8, and even then, you'd have to really specify what did each person do. The more people you add into writing a manuscript, the more concern you might have is, did they really meet the criteria to be listed as an author? Again, here's just a summary of what I discussed previously about determining authors' guidelines to be listed as an author. What criteria? You need to identify all their contributions and specify that when you submit your manuscript. If you have authors who really have not contributed directly to the manuscript so that they don't meet the criteria, they can be listed in an acknowledgement section at the end of the manuscript where you can acknowledge what contributions they did make. You can list their names there, and that is okay. But when you're listing someone as an author who really can't meet the criteria or who has not met the criteria, it is unethical and it's a violation of publication ethics. If you are the only author of an article and it'll say, did anybody else, any other authors, you just say none. But when you have other ones, you need to be sure to specify all the different things, how they met those A, B, and C criteria before. And I would encourage you not to be bullied into adding authors' names who are not really contributing. Sometimes an author just wants to get his or her name listed because maybe they need it for an academic appointment, or they just want to look like they've done something, and they might have talked to you about it, but they really did nothing. But they're at the end, they say, well, we let you do it in our department, so you should put our names in. That's unethical use of authorship, and I would discourage you not to do that. And if you have problems, show them what the guidelines are of what you have to follow when you submit. The guidelines are listed on the Journal of Trauma Nursing website. The last tips I'd like to provide for you is to provide a few reasons about why a manuscript might be rejected. I think if you have these in your mind beforehand, you can avoid dealing with the problems and eliminate them, so you'll have less chance of having your manuscript rejected. First of all, always consider what journal you're going to submit your manuscript to. Are you going to, what is your topic? Is your topic a good fit for the journal? So in trauma nursing, I covered a lot of, we run the whole continuum of care. So our Journal of Trauma Nursing actually covers a lot of different topics. However, I still might get some manuscripts submitted to the Journal of Trauma Nursing that are not really relevant to our subject matter or to our readers. So every editor will look at something and they'll say, if it's not a good fit, they will send you a rejection letter, usually pretty quickly, and say that we recommend you would submit to a different journal that would be a better fit for your topic. So if you can think in advance and decide where would be the best journals to submit your manuscript to, at least you'll have an idea, and you increase your chances of having it not to be rejected. Now, if you submit to a journal and you submit a manuscript where your information is too old, your references are much older, unless they're a landmark type of reference or a reference representing the gold standard. If it's things that you are talking about are too out of date, your manuscript will most likely be rejected. If you are writing about a topic, but you miss some really important contributions that should have been in the topic, the peer reviewers may recommend rejection of your topic because they feel there's too much that's left out. Now, you might get the opportunity to add that. The reviewers say, well, you might have to make a major revision by adding these in, and you should decide whether you want to do that or not. But it's good to make sure you've hit the highlights of a topic that when you're writing about it, so that someone can't say, well, they missed all this other major important information. If you are submitting a paper, again, that is purely an academic paper, or a paper used as a speech for school or a speech somewhere else, and you're just submitting it as it is without rewriting it and putting it in the format of the journal, it's going to be rejected. Most of the editors, I would say, that edit nursing journals specifically are also professors in colleges of nursing, and they are usually very good at recognizing a student paper. and they will send it back saying this is not in a format for a journal. This is your student paper and you didn't do anything. You just submitted your student paper. And that's not to say that you shouldn't submit the information you wrote about in your student paper. You just have to write it in the way in which it can be read in a journal, and which is usually a much shorter format, much more concise lit review, and making it sure that you meet the requirements of the journal guidelines for publication. If your topic is too narrow or only appeals to a small segment of readers, a journal might reject that because they might just think it's not going to be as big of a benefit to their readership as a whole. Again, that might depend on the journal as well. If you write a paper and it doesn't make a point, or you don't give the reader something to take away, you don't give them the lessons learned, or you don't give them the important information about it, they will reject your paper. It's like when I mentioned at the beginning, you're telling a story about something when you write. You're going to give the readers the beginning, a middle, and an end. So if you give them the beginning and the middle, but you don't give them the end, if there's nothing for them to take away, that's not a good story. That's not a good bit of information, and papers and manuscripts will be rejected because of that. So make sure you always have a conclusion. You always have, here's what we learned from this. Here's the end of the story. So say you're working on a quality improvement project at your facility, and you've gotten some of the data already analyzed. You have part of it, but you don't have the rest of it. You haven't. The rest of it's going to come a little later. You're collecting some other things, but you really don't have the end of the story. I would say don't submit a partially done project with the idea of, well, then when we get the rest of it, we'll submit it again. They won't publish it if they don't have the whole story. They're always looking. You always have to give them the ending. And one of the major reasons why manuscripts are rejected is if your writing style or grammar or spelling is just overall poor. If you don't check your spelling, if you don't use proper grammar and your style is choppy and difficult to read, it's a very common reason for manuscripts to get rejected. So how can you avoid having that happen? Have other people read your paper for you. They're usually good at spotting out spelling errors. They're usually good at saying, hey, this doesn't make sense. Maybe you should move this over here. So have a few of your friends or other peers in your organization review what you have and see what suggestions they might have to make recommendations to make your paper sound better, read better, and get your message across. Thanks for listening. I hope that this information that I provided will be helpful to you as you pursue your goal of writing for publication. If you publish in the Journal of Trauma Nursing, remember that our journal is published 6 times per year, and 2 of our issues are online only issues. We do have an impact factor for our journal. It is 0.852 and it's moving up. So consider asking questions if you need to of the editor. You can feel free to contact me at my email address, jtneditor@katschrader.com. And I thank you for your future submissions.